This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us tonight Mr. Buck Melton, who's been with us before on numerous times. And Buck, maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the spate of recent Supreme Court decisions.
Well, there's certainly a lot to discuss there, but before we get into that,
yes.
in our last episode, you announced that you were declining to run for president.
Yes.
My phone has been ringing off the hook with our disappointed viewers in TV land, and they're begging me to have you reconsider.
Well, Bucky, I know I've been under a lot of personal pressure myself, but unfortunately, we're the world enough in time. Maybe the next electoral cycle, I'll think about it again. But
I did my
there we
best,
go.
folks,
Okay, ha-ha, we had a little joke there. Ho-ho, that's amusing, isn't it? Well, okay, I guess maybe tonight we could talk about the recent decision involving the Affordable Care Act. We've had two substantial decisions. And maybe you can just opine about what happened in the most recent decision and what your viewpoints on that would be.
Yes, imagine, if you will, a speeding train and a bridge out in front of that train, and picture the train going over the cliff and exploding in midair. That's Chief Justice Roberts' opinion in the King versus Burwell case. Is that good enough, or shall I elaborate?
So, you're a constitutional scholar,
Yes.
a student of the court. So knowledgeable, I would use the word experts, that look into these decisions and sort of pass judgment on the intellectual rigor of the particular decision. They've found Chief Justice Roberts amiss on this particular decision. Is that correct?
Very much so. And if you start from the premise that Roberts is a smart man with excellent legal training and an excellent facility for legal logic, and then you see him do something like this, I think the only conclusion that somebody could reach is that he decided how he wanted this case to come out, and then constructed whatever legal arguments he could come up with to make that outcome be the case.
As I understand it, I mean, I certainly don't know all the intricacies of what's transpired here, but the law said one thing. It was
Yes.
a small part of a multi-thousand page law,
Yes.
and it said A. And then Justice Roberts said, well, even though it said A, the intent of this whole 1,000-page law was something else, and I'm going to go with what I perceive the intent of the legislature and the executive branch to be, not actually what the law says.
Well, not quite. If he had actually done that, he would have been on firmer ground. There's been a long-running, age-old debate going back at least to the 1400s about, do you do what the legislature said, or do you give effect to what it meant?
Yes.
Even sometimes in the face of what it said.
Yes.
And you to and fro that, it depends on who you ask. In this case, the legislature didn't say it, and the legislature didn't mean it either, but he went with what he wanted the legislature to have meant, even though the legislature didn't mean it.
Well, are you sure the legislature didn't mean it? I mean, didn't they really? If you queried this was a totally Democratic Party piece of legislation.
Yes.
If you said to everyone, well, we want this legislation to go through. If this doesn't work, then the bill won't work. Would you like to somehow change it, or did you really mean that you really want this Affordable Care Act to be the law of the land? If this particular passage is in there, it can't be.
Yes.
Don't you want to take it out, or didn't you really mean? Is that argument there?
I think that the fact that this wasn't entirely a Democratic proposition. The Democrats controlled the White House, the Senate, the House of Representatives. The Republicans had zero input on the drafting process, as far as I'm aware. The Republicans did not support it with a single vote at any point. So the Democrats ran the table.
Yes.
They could put whatever they wanted in
Right,
it.
right.
This was not the product of haggling or toing and froing. So given that, there's no place for the court to jump in the interstices and try to find out what some mythical lawmaker really wanted. Let's define what exactly Roberts did. The key phrase was that state healthcare or that healthcare exchanges established by the state. That's the four keyword of the entire thing. Established by the state shall receive tax credits and federal funding.
Yes.
And as far as we can tell, the intent of Congress was to do that, to encourage the states, to put a carrot in front of the states and get them to establish state exchanges. If a state didn't take the bait, if it didn't take that carrot, then the feds would establish an exchange for that state. But the law did not allow tax credits for a federal exchange. The question in King versus Burwell is, do the federal exchanges nevertheless get the tax credits? The law clearly did not indicate that. The intent of Congress was apparently not to allow that in order to give the states the carrot. And Roberts said, well, since so many states have not taken the carrot, it would destroy Obamacare if we didn't let the federal exchanges get the tax credits.
Yes.
Therefore, we have to give them the tax credits.
Well, the other
That's
argument-
not intent.
Well, now, what happens often, I mean, in these circumstances, if a law is miswritten,
Yes.
I'd phrase it that
Scrivener's
way,
error.
right? And
Yes.
then the courts find this law has been miswritten.
Yes.
Then they send it back to the legislature. and they correct it. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes. Scrivener's error, that there was just a mistake in the actual syntax or drafting, but there was no allegation of Scrivener's error either.
Yes.
There's no indication that the meaning was unclear. There was no indication that the intent was to fund the federal exchanges, quite the opposite. There is no indication that the text supported the funding of the federal exchanges. And in the face of all that, Roberts still said that the law permitted the funding of federal exchanges.
Now we've had a discussion about sort of what I mean, at least in earlier shows we've discussed this. The idea is very difficult to put a constitutional amendment there.
Yes.
And that the world is rushing ahead, these things are changing. And so if you're a person on Mount Olympus, you're one of the judges on Mount Olympus, and you say, really what the Constitution needs is they need a Western European kind of arrangement where everyone has access to health care. That ought to be part. If I were writing the Constitution these days, I would have put it in there. Obviously 250 years ago, it couldn't, you wouldn't have thought of putting it in there, but it should be part of the Constitution. It can't be passed otherwise, so I'm just going to put it in the Constitution. Is that sort of what happened here? The Supreme Court said some kind of federally mandated system of access to health care is going to happen.
Yes, and that raises the question that we brought up in our previous episode, that if you are doing something revolutionary, if you are deliberately making a quantum leap in some sort of economic arrangement or social mores, who should be the one to do that? Should it not be a majoritarian decision? Should that sort of thing be foisted off on the country by, in this case, two people?
Yes.
Because if two people had voted differently,
yes,
different outcome.
Now, one of the things about these enormous changes, another sort of thing we've touched on, I think, in the past, is the idea that the people that are making these decisions, rightly or wrongly, you could say they're trying to really change the country, and they've got the power to do that. They're really extremely powerful people, and they're doing decisions that we could say are outside, I guess, the normal restraints of legalisms. I mean, they're just going to go wherever they want to make and I think, give them credit, they want to make the country better, and they would use the word fairer, I think. They say a fairer, better, more equal country where everyone has access to the cornucopia of goodies that the country has, and that I think they push, that would say liberty and equality would be what they would proceed to try and obtain. And their backgrounds are very, very different than the people that live in, you could call it, flyover country. So if we I think earlier discussed that some of the things that happened in the earlier part of the century or last century was the judicial system would be filled with men, really waspy men who had a lot of property or pursued property, and they would protect property. And then we have a totally different system now where the people in the Supreme Court are from a narrow, very narrow group of people. And their backgrounds are extraordinarily different than most American people, if I can say it that way.
And
They're
similar to each other. Most of them are Harvard Law School grads, Yale Law School grads. They're coming out of professorships.
And they've not had any, yes. I mean, have just to ask a question, has any of them had legislative experience? I mean, the Justice Earl Warren was famously
Attorney General of California.
I think it might have been even more than that. I mean, it's sort of a big, so in the past, going back for several hundred years, a lot of the people in the Supreme Court had a legislative background. They understood the legislature, they understood politics, and there used to be a system in place where these justices would come from different parts of the country. So you would have, this is going to be the Southern Justice or the Western, so they would try and put people from different parts of the country. And often the background of those people would reflect the section they came from, if I could phrase it that way. Yes. And now it's impressive to me that if you examine the background of the 5 people that are on the Supreme Court majority here, it's an impressively narrow background.
Yes.
And I'm forced to make this comment. You know, there are no Protestants on the Supreme Court, no Protestants. And if we're having some kind of ethical discussion, if the Supreme Court is trafficking in ethics or morality, you could well say we need a person that reflects that viewpoint. And you could also say, well, if we have a large Islamic population, maybe that too. I mean, and why not a graduate from a state law school or somebody that's lived in provincial America? I mean, it seems to be a very narrow.
Yes.
Narrow
well, if we're going to do that, if we are going to try to make the court reflect the ethnic or sociocultural makeup of America, then we're treating the court as if it is a legislature. And if we are going to have a court that is a legislature, do we need a court at all? Why don't we just do away with it and have, I don't know, a legislature called the Congress?
Well, it's checks and balances. And so it's a, well, I mean, you can
it
make
should be, but is it?
But, yes. What I guess I'm saying is that if the court has such enormous power to basically propagate what amounts to constitutional amendments, they're propagating constitutional amendments, 5 people. I'll also say this, and I've brought the issue up before, do we really need lawyers on the Supreme Court? I mean, let's say, well, I don't know, we could pick some local physician or something. Send the person up there that knows nothing about law, just has some kind of, moral viewpoints, or and if he was going to decide, well, we need this federal health care legislation. It needs to be in there. The country needs that. That's going to be the right thing for our future. And this is my chance to make it happen. And who cares about these law books? Yes. I'll just tell my very bright law clerks, I've decided I want this to happen. Go in there and cook up some kind of deal there.
Yes.
And all you have to do is just find a few cases to support it and say these are more important than the other cases.
Yes. Well, Justice Scalia, I think once mentioned, and this has really stuck with me since I heard this from him, that if you look at these big, massive constitutional law cases that deal with the great deep issues of our day and the divisive issues, yes, certainly it seems that you don't need the legal training. But in the dozens of other cases that you have involving federal patent law or something highly technical like that, that's where the legal training comes in. But let's take your argument even farther. Let's come up with the Super Supreme Court. And the Super Supreme Court doesn't get the technicality-driven patent. And I will say that patent law is about as bad as it gets.
It sounds tough.
But the big cases that could be seen, we'll call them the quantum leap cases.
Yes.
I've been using that phrase a lot tonight. The quantum leap cases that really deal with major socio-cultural changes in the fabric of either the American economy, like the Affordable Care Act, or American social mores, like same-sex marriage. We will give the Super Supreme Court only those types of cases in which law is not as important as morality, justice, fairness, whatever label you want to put on it. But in that case, you are amending the Constitution, and it seems to me that if you look at the amendment process is supposed to be very broad-based and populist, if you will, in nature, not elitist.
Yes.
And the Supreme Court of 9 people, or even the Super Supreme Court of 9 people, is elitist.
The joke is 9 lawyers. I don't know if that's a joke, but yes. And so if you're opining on broad issues, I mean, really, it's a pretty narrow viewpoint from which these decisions are being propagated. People live mostly in New York City or the urban Northeast, or they have this, and the group around them is going to be tilted. Not for everyone, but at least some part of the group are going to be tilted in either direction. And there are conservative people in the Supreme Court too.
Oh, yes.
And the group around them would be
Yes.
tilted in a particular direction. There's sort of a self-reinforcing.
Yes, and I would imagine, and these clerks are also going to be very, very smart people. I myself have not clerked for the Supreme Court. Very few people get to do that. But I have, in fact, been the teacher or the professor of
Yes.
some people who have clerked for the Supreme Court. And they are themselves extremely smart and often will go on to become Supreme Court justices,
right.
John Roberts being an example.
Yes, yes.
But at the same time, in addition to sharing this delight in playing these esoteric word games, they're probably also a bit sycophantic. I mean, wow, gee, I'm working for the Supreme Court.
Right.
I'm working for Justice X. He's letting me helping to write the law of the
Right.
land with me just 2 years out of law school.
Yes.
And that's not maybe a healthy thing
Well,
for American democracy.
the issue that comes up is the difference between wisdom and intelligence. And so obviously
Yes.
the two circles don't always meet, do they?
Yes.
And now, not to say that you could also make this case. I mean, we talked about the healthcare system. I participate in it. I see all its virtues and defects, and I'd like to see the system do a lot better than it's doing
Yes.
now. And I wish we had appropriate legislation to have that happen. And I give the Democrats and President Obama, I give them a gold star for trying to do something.
Mm-hmm.
They deserve a gold star. But the system that's in place now is so inadequate for the task before it. But I'll give them a gold star for making some efforts in that direction. The Supreme Court is in the position really to try and to change the world, are they not? And they go in there. You could change the world if you
Yes. And that can be dangerous. And I think it's the difference between what might be viewed as ownership versus stewardship or trusteeship.
Yes.
That America is in love with the concept of progress and the concept of change. And that's really been an article of faith for what I'll broadly call progressivism for over a century now. And I think that is dangerous for the concept of stewardship or trusteeship. If you believe in trusteeship and you find yourself president or on the Supreme Court, then you'll think, what has been handed on to me and how can I care for it and hand it on intact to my successor?
Yes.
Whereas the idea of ownership, of me getting to play my role in change, very cynically, one of the most notorious popes in history, Urban II, who reigned about 1,000 years ago, give or take, is supposed to have infamously said when he was elected, "The papacy is ours, therefore let us enjoy it." Let's do what we want with
Yes,
it.
yes.
Or as Emperor Palpatine once said, power, absolute power.
Right, right.
And it goes to their heads.
Yes.
And that is not the makings for good law.
Yes, yes. Well, now, so you've really been quite critical of Chief Justice Roberts. Presumably, the other people that supported his decision,
And there
also,
are, and it did take.
also, all right,
yes, he
the
did
other
do it
people
alone.
are on there. They supported his decision,
Yes.
and were they equally intellectually disingenuous? I mean, did they all fall into this illogical trap? All of them did.
Well, they certainly signed off on the opinion, but the very fact, and I am not what might be called a court watcher.
Yes.
Going into the extensive biographies of each justice,
Right.
number crunching who voted for
Right,
what,
right, right.
and predicting it. But when my wife, Dr. Melton, told me that King versus Burwell had been announced and it was 6-3, I said the three are Scalia, Alito, and Thomas, yes?
Right.
And the very fact that I can do that,
Yes.
that it doesn't take a brain surgeon
Yeah,
such as yourself to do that,
touche, yeah.
you know, that does not speak well of the Supreme Court. It means that I can tell you based on the ideologies of the judges, not on the basis of the law, but on
Yes.
the basis of how they liked things to come out,
Yes.
how they voted.
Yes.
And I did it again on the very next day with the same-sex marriage case.
Yes. Well, I mean, so people are, I guess they're trying to create another country in a way. And the query to be asked is there an argument for another country? If we are really having, we mentioned change, it's extraordinary to see the events that are taking place with ethnicity in the country. We have a very porous border, income redistribution, the different values, you could say the sort of European cultural imprint of the country is substantially being diminished.
Yes.
The cultural values are changing, all these things are changing very, very, very rapidly. I mean, just decade by decade, year by year.
Progressivism.
But I mean, the economic arrangements, the whole scientific events that are taking place, the power of the internet, I mean, all these things are going on at lightning speed. Do the courts have to sort of get in sync with all these changes? I guess I would ask that question.
Well, this is this question of deep political philosophy, and you go back to Rousseau on the one hand versus Edmund Burke on the other, and what is the role of the courts? Is if the legislature is designed to adapt and leap forward and deal with new issues as they come up, is it the court that is supposed to be saying, wait a minute, softly, softly,
Yes.
let's look at this and deliberate about it? And you know, other people would say absolutely not. The court needs to get with the program as well. And that's what I mean, that we have this slavish worship of the idea of progress, that change is always better in this country, that the idea of we need to do it the way it's always been done before, or at least consider that there is some wisdom in how it's always been done. That is not a popular concept in America. It hasn't been for 100 years. I won't say it's non-existent, but progressivism has for the better part of 100 years been in the fore.
You know, I noticed that you quoted Edmund Burke there, and I would say is that this is really sort of a Eurocentric kind of viewpoint about
Yes.
what's up and what's down. People might say, well, Che Guevara might be the person I'd speak to, or Confucius, or Buddha. I mean, what did Buddha have to say about this? What Gandhi? What happened? I mean, what's their new philosophies, new viewpoints, some other cultures? What does the Quran say about it? I mean, you know, maybe there's some I don't know, Islamic scholar that has a certain viewpoint that's not commonly out there.
Yes.
And so the idea that the country may really be a Western country, which I mean, I'm certainly imprinted with those ideas.
Yes.
That's what my viewpoint is. Edmund Burke, you know, the
Yes,
French
yes.
Revolution. That would be something I'd be quite at least have an acquaintance with those viewpoints. But the way the world is going, this Eurocentric kind of thing, and this diverse country, 320 million people, the population has rocketed up since 1990. We've added a quarter. I don't know how many people is that? 80 million people to the
Yes.
population
Yes.
in 25 years.
Yes.
I mean, and if you look at the demographic events going on, the viewpoints that are being expressed, there's a real collision out there.
Indeed.
The centrifugal force is enormous.
Yes, and it's not just Eurocentric. I mean, talking about the Supreme Court and the American judicial system, it's even more particularized than that. It is the Anglo-American common law tradition. And in that regard, the English tradition is out of step even with most of Europe, which is code law driven, or Eastern Europe, which is very different from that.
Yes.
Not even getting into East Asia, for instance,
Yes,
or
right,
the Middle
right,
East.
right.
The idea of precedent, of stare decisis, of judge-made law, all this is very particularized to something that we've taken for granted for 200 years, and now maybe not.
Okay, now actually, now we've gotten to the point I'd like to make here, having made that circle, is the values, whatever kind of values that you would say would be useful for the country. The courts have to sort of defend and protect those values with this onslaught of different kind of viewpoints. The centrifugal force is so powerful out there that we have to have some kind of common American identity, some kind of flag to rally around. And that's a very difficult process. The country is so diverse, and it's maybe more than ever. The difference between, I don't know, some circles in Manhattan and some circles in South Georgia, there's just a huge barriers. There are all these problems there. Can the legal system establish justice for the country? So justice turns out to be a big deal. I mean, we could talk about law, we could talk about justice, but the country needs the idea that they live in a just country and a moral country. And the Supreme Court, it turns out to be the final secular arbitrator of that. If you say there's some kind of secular, almost religion, Americanism,
The civil religion.
the Americanism, and the high priests and priestesses of that secular religion would be the courts. They say these are the covenant. This is what you believe if you're an American, and I'm going to write it down. And every decision, I say what the moral compass of the country is.
Yes. Well, what if that moral compass is coming out of the Northeast and it is something alien to the Bible Belt? I think you've got a major problem, and then it's a question of whether or not the high priest and high priestess will have enough clout to make it stick. And I think they're just brainstorming here a couple of different flavors. Number one, if the civil religion, if the priest and priestess say that you can't tell others that they can't do X, for instance, same-sex marriage. You in the Bible Belt can't prohibit others from having what you have. That's one thing. The next step would be you must kowtow to something else. For instance, you must perform same-sex marriage in the Bible Baptist Church in rural Arlington, Georgia, which would be the logical next step. So the question is, how far can the priests and priestesses push it? And on occasion, they have overplayed their hand. The Dred Scott case, the legal tender cases, several cases during the New Deal.
But you know, the power of the government is so impressive. I mean, you could make the case, and I mean, many people would speculate. We talked about societal change, but the power of the government to be intrusive, to say what's going on, the computer power, the way they can, I don't know, monitor this, monitor that, and presumably they can do all kinds of things to you if they wanted to. They've got IRS issues, they've got this, they've got that, and so the internet is there. They could do many, many things that are heinous and rather easily. They put your name on a list, and it would be, say, very difficult to do that in 1890. I mean, to have this power. So the governmental power, and thus the power of the Supreme Court, to really impact the world is really there more than in the past, I think.
Well, it's not just the government's ability to intrude, but its proclivity to intrude in the last 120 years that has been a cause of great concern. If you see the growth of unelected bureaucrats, the massive growth of federal regulations in the last 100 years, it's probably practically impossible for the average citizen to get through life today without breaking at least some law that he doesn't even know about.
Well, dare I eat a peach, to quote T.S. Eliot. You know, it's very difficult not to just live and just do your best in life.
Yes.
Well, all right, Bucky. That's a very enlightening conversation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We'll have another interchange soon.
Indeed.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.